Tonight, the first topic we explore is the life and journey of Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant whose travels helped bridge the medieval West and the mysterious East. From crossing the treacherous Silk Road to serving in the court of Kublai Khan, Polo's experiences painted a picture of Asia that fascinated and confused Europe for generations. His detailed accounts of glittering cities, strange customs, and powerful empires became one of the most influential travelogues in history. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are too interesting, and we are working on some boring ones. It's time now to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight, together. The year was 1254, Venice, a city built not just on water but on wealth, ambition, and quiet whispers of distant lands. Its merchants sailed farther, bargained harder, and dreamed bigger than most across medieval Europe. And into this world of salt air, silver coins, and silk bolts was born a boy named Marco Polo. He came into the world without his father by his side. Niccolo Polo, a merchant by trade and an adventurer at heart, was already deep in the east, somewhere along the caravan trails of Central Asia. Marco wouldn't see him, not once, for the first 15 years of his life. His childhood was shaped not by a father's voice, but by his absence, and the stories that filled that silence. Marco grew up under the care of his mother and extended family, surrounded by maps, merchant ledgers, and the dull clink of coins being counted. But more than anything, he heard tales of Constantinople's domes, the cold winds of the Caucasus, and the endless golden lands beyond Persia. These weren't bedtime stories. They were rumours. Whispers carried by returning sailors and spice traders, half believed and half dreamed. By the time Niccolo returned to Venice in 1269, Marco was a teenager, tall for his age, curious, and bright-eyed. He met not only the father he'd never known, but also an uncle, Maffeo Polo, with whom Niccolo had crossed mountains, rivers, and empires. Their return was not merely a family reunion. They brought a message from the most powerful man in the East, Kublai Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire. And the Khan had made a bold request, that the Polos return to his court, not alone this time, but with a representative from the Latin Church, and if possible, a young man of promise. Marco, now about 17, was chosen. He wasn't a warrior, he wasn't a noble, he wasn't even a trained diplomat, but he was clever, observant, and utterly captivated by the idea of going where few Westerners had gone before. So began a journey that would stretch across deserts, mountains, and legends. The boy from Venice was about to become a bridge between two worlds, and his name, Marco Polo, would one day echo across centuries. Marco Polo's journey into the unknown began not with fanfare, but with quiet determination. In 1271, Marco, his father Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo left Venice once again, this time together, to fulfill Kublai Khan's request and carry letters from Pope Gregory to the great Mongol ruler in the east. Their path wasn't a single road, but a sprawling web of trade routes known as the Silk Road, a 1,000-threaded artery connecting Europe with the mysteries of Asia. From the Mediterranean coast, they travelled by sea to Acre in the Holy Land, then crossed through Armenia and Persia, passing through scorched deserts and high plateaus, where the air turned thin and cold. They slept under starlit skies and woke to winds that carried strange scents of spices, camel sweat, and distant fires. Some days brought encounters with hospitable local rulers. Other days, they faced suspicious eyes, bandits, or silence in towns that looked like ghost cities after war or plague. Marco, just a teenager, proved more than capable of keeping pace. He absorbed languages quickly, learned customs respectfully, and scribbled down observations in his mind about architecture, dress, coins, and even superstitions. Where others saw hardship, he saw a living map unfolding before him. Every stop was a puzzle piece in the world's grand design. In Persia, the death of the Mongol Ilkhan delayed them. The road ahead to China had become more dangerous, but the Polos pushed on, determined to fulfill their promise. They passed through Badakhshan, a remote kingdom where Marco fell ill and rested for months, and then continued along the treacherous Pamir Mountains, where snow still clung to jagged rocks even in summer. They crossed the vast Gobi Desert, a brutal stretch of dust and hallucination where sandstorms could bury a man alive, and water was more precious than gold. And yet, they endured. 3.5 years after they left Venice, the Polos finally reached the court of Kublai Khan, in what is now northern China, sometime around 1275. They stood at the gates of the largest empire the world had ever seen. And Marco Polo, the Venetian boy no one expected much from, was about to enter the inner circle of a ruler more powerful than any king in Europe. When Marco Polo entered the court of Kublai Khan, it must have felt like stepping into another world entirely. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, a vast dominion held together by force, strategy, and a deep curiosity about the wider world. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, ruled not just as a warrior emperor, but as a builder of cities, a patron of science, and a man fascinated by foreign knowledge. His palace in Khanbalik, what is today Beijing, was no mere tented camp. It was a city of marble, gold, and sprawling gardens, more magnificent than any place Marco had seen in Venice. And the Khan took a liking to him. Young, observant, and eager to learn, Marco spoke with grace and intelligence. He was fascinated by everything: the customs of the Mongols, the layout of the court, the mix of cultures and religions that flowed through the empire like a river. To the Khan, this foreigner wasn't just another guest. He was a useful mind. Within a short time, Marco was given a role that few outsiders ever achieved. He became a trusted emissary of the Mongol court. The tasks were immense. Kublai sent Marco to distant provinces to report on the state of roads, crops, politics, and even rumours of unrest. These journeys brought Marco into lands no European had likely recorded before, from the jungles of Burma to the highlands of Tibet. He saw wonders the West had never imagined: paper money backed by imperial decree, coal used for heating, cities lit with lanterns, and organised courier systems that moved information faster than anywhere in Europe. Marco wasn't just witnessing history, he was living inside it. And everywhere he went, he took mental notes of strange beasts, unusual rituals, and cities bustling with trade. He remembered how the Khan's subjects bowed, how justice was carried out, and how diverse this empire truly was. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and Confucians all lived under one ruler, often in surprising harmony. For 17 years, Marco served the Khan, not as a soldier or spy, but as a bridge between cultures. And the longer he stayed, the harder it became to imagine ever returning home. Venice had faded into memory. China had become his new reality. As Marco Polo crisscrossed the vast Mongol Empire, he became more than just a guest in Kublai Khan's court. He became the empire's eyes. Trusted with sensitive missions, he was sent to the outer edges of the realm, to places few had seen and even fewer had returned from. And what he saw left a permanent mark on his memory. He journeyed through lands of snow leopards and burning sands, through jungles echoing with unfamiliar bird song, and across rivers the colour of jade. Some cities sat on cliffs that touched the sky, others sprawled like labyrinths across desert plains. He rode for weeks without seeing a single stone house, only yurts, smoke, and the distant silhouettes of riders on the horizon. He visited Yunnan, a region thick with forests and rare spices. He witnessed salt being harvested from lakes that turned pink in the sun. He spoke with governors who ruled by the Khan's command and kept order in towns where Buddhist chants blended with the call to prayer from distant mosques. Everywhere he went, he saw signs of order and discipline, enforced by the dreaded Yam system, a network of stations and horses that kept the empire connected at terrifying speed. Marco marveled at technologies the West hadn't yet imagined. He saw paper currency being used like gold, passports issued by the Khan that guaranteed safe travel, and bridges so vast they spanned rivers like delicate stone lace. He described fireworks used not just for celebration, but to terrify enemies during battle. Even sanitation and city planning were more advanced than anything he knew from Venice. But he also witnessed cruelty, public punishments for thieves, brutal taxes on peasants, entire villages relocated for imperial projects. The greatness of the Mongol world came at a cost, and Marco noticed both the beauty and the burden. What astonished him most wasn't just the size of the empire, it was its diversity. No single religion ruled, no single race dominated. Kublai governed a patchwork of cultures, stitched together by fear, awe, and the promise of order. Marco took all of it in, with the eyes of a foreigner and the memory of a storyteller. He didn't just travel through cities, he travelled through worlds. By now, Marco Polo was no longer just an outsider in the Mongol world. He was a familiar face in the inner circles of Kublai Khan. Trusted, fluent in languages, and endlessly curious, he had earned what few Westerners ever could: the personal confidence of an emperor who ruled over more people than any king in Europe. The great Khan relied on Marco not only as a messenger but as an observer. He was sent to administer tax inspections, gather intelligence on rebellions, and assess the morale of distant governors. His Venetian background, oddly enough, made him valuable. He had no local alliances, no tribal loyalties. He could be objective. Also, the Khan believed. And Marco delivered. He navigated the vast imperial bureaucracy with a mix of charm and observation. He remembered everything: how a river village fished with trained birds, how a remote temple kept its sacred texts preserved in gold leaf scrolls, how a single fire signal could summon a cavalry regiment within hours. These details weren't just trivia. They were threads in the great fabric of an empire that ran on information. Marco's Western appearance made him a curiosity in many places, especially among the people of the Chinese provinces who had never seen a European before. But he never spoke down. He watched, listened, and learned. He respected local customs, and that respect earned him access to places even other Mongols avoided. He witnessed the court's rituals, elaborate ceremonies with music, incense, and dancers veiled in silk. He saw the Khan receive foreign ambassadors bearing tribute, pearls from India, ivory from Africa, and even lions from Persia. The Mongol court was not just a seat of power. It was the beating heart of a global network, where merchants, mystics, and spies all gathered. Through it all, Marco remained something rare, an observer who did not yet belong, but who was trusted as if he did. Still, as the years passed, one thought returned more and more often: Venice. His home. His people. His name. He had arrived as a boy with wide eyes. Now he was a man in his 30s, shaped by the East, but carrying a longing for the West. And eventually, even Marco Polo would have to ask, how long can a visitor remain before he forgets how to return? After nearly 2 decades in the East, Marco Polo had become more than just a Venetian abroad. He had become a man of 2 worlds, trusted by the Mongol court, fluent in Asian dialects, and filled with memories that no European could even begin to imagine. But Venice still lived in his heart like a distant dream. The moment to leave finally arrived in the early 1290s. Kublai Khan was growing old, and the empire he had masterfully ruled was starting to fray at the edges. Intrigue brewed among his heirs. Factions whispered behind silk screens. The Khan, reluctant to lose one of his most loyal envoys, delayed the Polo's departure more than once, but fate intervened. A Mongol princess was to be married to a Persian prince, a delicate political alliance that needed trusted escorts. The overland route was deemed too dangerous, so Kublai permitted the Polos to accompany her by sea. It was a rare opportunity, and a risky one. Their departure was bittersweet. Marco had spent more than half his life in Asia. He left behind friends, a language he had come to love, and a way of life that had become second nature. But the open sea called, and with it, the chance to return to the place he still called home. The voyage was brutal. Their fleet, filled with Persian nobles, Mongol officials and servants, sailed south along the coast of China, then west through the Indian Ocean. Storms ravaged their ships. Disease spread in the crowded holds. By the time they reached Persia, hundreds were dead, including the Persian groom, meant for the princess they had so carefully escorted. Still, the Polos survived. From Persia, they travelled once again overland, passing through Armenia, Anatolia, and finally reaching the Mediterranean world. It had been over 2 decades since they had left, and everything had changed. Venice was now at war with Genoa, and the streets Marco remembered were filled with soldiers, suspicion, and unfamiliar faces. They arrived home, not as heroes but as strangers. Their clothes were foreign. Their speech was accented. Even their stories seemed too wild to believe. But Marco had one final mission left, to write it all down. Marco Polo had returned home, but peace didn't last long. Venice, embroiled in a bitter naval war with Genoa, soon drafted Marco into service. He had just survived deserts and dynasties, but now found himself in a sea battle off the coast of Anatolia. Captured in 1298, Marco was thrown into a Genoese prison cell, cold, damp, and dimly lit. But it was there, behind stone walls, that his most important journey would begin. Because in that cell, Marco met a man named Rustichello da Pisa, a writer of romances and courtly tales, and Marco, with nothing else to do, began to speak. He told Rustichello everything, about the Silk Road, about Kublai Khan's court, about snow leopards, paper money, black stones that burned like firewood, coal, cities with millions of people, rituals, armies, spices, and customs so foreign they sounded like fantasy. Rustichello wrote as Marco dictated, line after line, story after story. It was more than a travelogue, it was a revelation. The book, eventually known as Il Milione, or The Travels of Marco Polo, spread like wildfire across Europe. Though literacy was rare, the tales were told aloud in courts and taverns, passed along by sailors and scribes. Some believed it was a treasure map in disguise. Others thought it was pure fiction. How could a European have dined with emperors in China, seen rhinos mistaken for unicorns, described cities larger than Rome and systems more advanced than any in Christendom? But Marco never wavered. Even years later, on his deathbed, when friends urged him to admit he had exaggerated, he is said to have replied, "I did not tell half of what I saw." The book was many things: a manual for merchants, a source of inspiration for explorers, and, for some, a window into a magical East. To the medieval mind, it was hard to separate fact from myth, but what mattered most was that Marco's words planted a seed. His stories suggested that the world was far bigger than anyone dared imagine. He had travelled across the spine of the earth, and now, through the power of a book, he invited the West to follow. Marco Polo eventually walked free from prison, returning once again to the familiar canals of Venice. But something had changed, not just in him, but in the world around him. He had returned home a second time, no longer unknown, no longer doubted by all. The travels of Marco Polo had captured the imagination of Europe. Kings, merchants, monks, and even ordinary townsfolk were talking about Cathay, the name Marco used for China, and of golden palaces, vast armies, and spices that could change a dish or preserve a corpse. For most people in the West, his words painted the first vivid picture of the East. The book described paper currency, a courier system that put Europe's to shame, grand cities like Hangzhou and Kanbalik, and peoples who lived and prayed in ways unrecognizable to Latin Christendom. It blurred the line between fact and wonder, but it planted something powerful: curiosity. Marco didn't become fabulously wealthy, nor did he return to power in court or politics. He resumed life as a merchant, quiet and dignified, living out his days in his native city. But his influence outlived him and rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined. One of the minds his book would touch belonged to a young Genoese sailor nearly 2 centuries later, a man named Christopher Columbus. Columbus carried a copy of the Travels with him, scribbled with notes in the margins. He believed Marco's descriptions of the East and hoped to reach it by going west, across the ocean. That alone speaks volumes. Marco had not discovered new lands, he had not conquered, but he had described, and in doing so, opened doors in the minds of others. He gave Europe a reason to look beyond its borders and believe there was more to find. Many historians have debated the accuracy of his account. Some claim he never went to China, others say he exaggerated. But in truth, it hardly matters. Because Marco Polo's real achievement was not the miles he walked, but the horizon he stretched for those who stayed behind. And for centuries to come, whenever the West looked east, it did so through his eyes. Marco Polo lived to the age of 69, passing away in 1324, not in some distant land, but in the city where his journey had begun. Venice. The boy who once wandered through empires, deserts, and palace gates was laid to rest not far from the lagoon he knew as a child. But even in death, his story lingered. In his will, Marco left behind not only his belongings, but the weight of a life shaped by memory. Silks, jade, rare objects from the East, quiet evidence that what he spoke of had not been mere tales. He left instructions for charitable donations and freed a Tatar servant who had travelled with him for years, a final nod to the world beyond Venice that had shaped his soul. Yet even as he lay dying, people doubted him. His stories were too large, his adventures too strange. And so the man who had stood at the centre of the Mongol Empire, who had been entrusted with the secrets of Asia's greatest ruler, died with many of his own countrymen still unconvinced. But time, as it often does, would shift that narrative. In the centuries after his death, the travels of Marco Polo continued to be copied, translated, and reimagined. It became part travelogue, part mythology, a bridge between medieval Europe's narrow worldview and the sprawling complexity of the East. Some read it as scripture, others as fantasy, but nearly all who read it felt something stir, the sense that the world was vaster than they'd been told. Today, historians continue to debate his account, what he saw, what he exaggerated, what he misunderstood. But whether he was always accurate or sometimes mistaken is beside the point. Because Marco Polo did what few could. He connected worlds, not through conquest or crusade, but through curiosity, through observation, through storytelling. He left behind no throne, no inventions, no army, just a book. But that book would inspire explorers, cartographers, philosophers, and poets. It would be read in candlelit monasteries and on ships drifting westward across uncharted seas. And long after his footsteps faded from the sand and snow, the echo of his voice continued, telling us all that wonder lies just beyond the horizon. Oh. Long before perfume became a luxury, it was a prayer. In ancient Egypt, scent was more than a pleasant indulgence. It was sacred. The word perfume itself comes from the Latin per fumum, meaning through smoke, a fitting origin, because that's how it began, with incense rising skyward in spirals during sacred rites. To the Egyptians, fragrance wasn't simply pleasing, it was divine. It was the invisible language of gods. Temples across the Nile Valley were thick with the scent of burning myrrh, frankincense, and kyphi, a complex blend of resins, honey, wine, and aromatic herbs. Priests would offer these fragrances to the gods as a form of communication. The rising smoke symbolized the soul ascending, a message sent from earth to heaven. Perfume was woven into every layer of spiritual and royal life. The dead were embalmed with scented oils, their tombs filled with perfume vessels to ensure they remained fragrant in the afterlife. To smell sweet was to be pure, closer to the divine. Even ordinary people believed that pleasing aromas could ward off evil spirits. Then there was the realm of royalty. Pharaohs anointed themselves with sacred oils before rituals and battles. Scent became part of power. The higher one's rank, the more complex and costly their perfume. Alabaster jars held oils infused with cinnamon, cardamom, and lotus, precious ingredients imported from far-off lands. Perhaps the most iconic example was Cleopatra. Legend tells us she was a master of scent. She would soak the sails of her royal barge in rose water so the wind would carry her fragrance downriver before her arrival. She used scent not just for allure, but as a weapon, a way to control perception, to announce her power before her presence. Even in death, the importance of scent endured. When Tutankhamun's tomb was opened in 1922, archaeologists reported a faint trace of perfume lingering after 3,000 years. In Egypt, scent was never just about beauty. It was belief. It was memory. It was a thread connecting the human to the eternal, invisible but undeniable. And as other civilizations rose, they too would inherit this ancient knowledge and carry perfume across deserts, mountains, and time. As ancient Egypt faded into memory, the torch of fragrance passed eastward, into lands of spice, silk, and sacred ritual. In Mesopotamia, among the ziggurats and temples of Sumer, perfume continued to serve as a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Clay tablets dating back over 4,000 years described the preparation of scented oils using cedar, myrrh, and cypress. These oils were applied to statues of gods, rubbed onto priests, and sealed into burial urns. Even early kings sought to smell divine. Farther east, in the lush lands of the Indus Valley and ancient India, the connection between scent and spirit deepened. Vedic texts spoke of gandha, fragrance, as one of the key elements of sacred worship. Temples were filled with the aroma of sandalwood paste and floral garlands. The air itself was part of the prayer. Here, perfume was more than ritual. It was part of love, marriage, and daily life. India became one of the first cultures to truly specialize in attar making, the distillation of flowers into oil, often using sandalwood as a base. Even today, traditional attars are still made by artisans who follow methods unchanged for centuries, letting the scent of jasmine, rose, or vetiver slowly infuse oil drop by drop over a low flame and much patience. In Persia, the love of gardens became a love of perfume. Kings like Cyrus and Darius surrounded themselves with roses and violets, not just for beauty, but for their scent. The Persian word for rose, gul, found its way into every corner of culture, from poetry to medicine. Their palaces were designed to carry fragrance through the breeze, and scent was a marker of elegance and refinement. China, too, embraced perfume, though with more subtlety. There, it was associated with balance, inner harmony, and scholarly reflection. Scrolls were perfumed. Inkstones and robes were lightly scented with agar wood or cassia bark. Perfume was not loud. It was meditative, a soft breath of calm, not a declaration. Across these lands, perfume was evolving. No longer just a sacrifice to gods or a mask for the dead. It was now a living art, a science, a gesture of grace. From temple smoke to flower oil, scent had become civilization's quiet signature. As the ancient world shifted westward, perfume followed, winding its way into the philosophies of Greece and the extravagance of Rome. What began as sacred incense in temples became, in these civilizations, a symbol of sophistication, wealth, and even virtue. In classical Greece, perfume was embraced both as art and as medicine. Physicians like Hippocrates prescribed aromatic baths and oils to treat ailments of the mind and body. The philosopher Theophrastus wrote extensively on the properties of plants and the emotional power of scent. Perfume, he believed, could lift the spirit, sharpen the intellect, and soothe melancholy. Fragrance also played a role in daily grooming and ritual. Greek athletes rubbed themselves with scented oils before and after competitions. Women perfumed their hair and garments with oils of iris, marjoram, and rose. And yet, moderation was expected. Too much perfume, especially on men, was viewed as a sign of vanity, or worse, moral weakness. Scent, to the Greeks, had to be balanced, much like everything else in life. The Romans, however, embraced perfume with abandon. By the time of the Roman Empire, fragrance had become a symbol of elite excess. The wealthy drenched their banquet halls in rosewater. Servants sprinkled perfumed snow from ceilings during feasts. Emperors like Nero reportedly spent fortunes importing Arabian myrrh and Indian sandalwood. Cleopatra's earlier rose-scented grand entrances inspired similar theatricality in Roman society. Perfume wasn't just worn, it was displayed. Glass vessels were crafted to hold rare oils, and perfumers became prized artisans. Roman baths featured entire rooms dedicated to fragrance, and the air of public spaces often carried the aroma of spices and flowers. But there was tension beneath the luxury. Moralists like Seneca and Pliny the Elder warned of perfume's corrupting influence, that it weakened the will and distracted from virtue. As Christianity began to take root in the later Roman era, this suspicion deepened. The Church viewed perfume as indulgent and worldly, a temptation best left behind. And so, as Rome declined, so too did perfume in the West. The baths grew quiet, the amphorae ran dry, and the once powerful rituals of scent slipped into silence. But the story was far from over. Far to the east, another world was breathing new life into fragrance, and preparing to send it back westward, transformed. As the Western world turned away from perfume, deeming it a worldly indulgence, the East, particularly the Islamic world, transformed it into a refined science and sacred tradition. From the 7th century onward, the rise of Islam brought with it a deep respect for cleanliness, beauty, and scent. The Prophet Muhammad himself spoke fondly of fragrance, saying it was one of the things made beloved to him in this world. He encouraged its use before prayer and in daily life. Wearing perfume became not just a luxury, but an expression of faith. It was in this rich cultural environment that perfume reached new heights. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo became centers of innovation. Perfumers, known as atarnines, experimented with distillation techniques and botanical alchemy. They extracted essential oils from flowers, woods, spices, and resins, using methods far more advanced than anything seen in Europe at the time. One figure stands out: Ibn Sina, also known in the West as Avicenna. This Persian polymath revolutionized perfume making by developing steam distillation, which allowed for the efficient extraction of flower essences, especially rose. His discovery changed everything. It enabled perfumers to isolate pure aromas, more delicate, more consistent, and longer lasting. Arab traders carried these refined scents across the known world. Frankincense from Oman, oud from Southeast Asia, musk from Tibet, and ambergris from the sea. Glass flasks filled with precious oils moved along trade routes from India to Spain, leaving behind fragrant traces and new cultural practices wherever they passed. Perfume in the Islamic world wasn't just about personal pleasure. It was woven into public life. Mosques were perfumed before prayer. Homes welcomed guests with scented hands, and rooms laced with bakhur, burning chips of oud. Even the pages of the Quran were sometimes lightly scented, a symbolic gesture of reverence. While Europe associated perfume with decadence and decline, the Islamic world elevated it into something spiritual, artistic, and essential. And as the Crusades and trade routes brought East and West into contact once again, the knowledge preserved and enhanced by Muslim perfumers began to return, quietly, potently, to a Europe ready to fall in love with scent all over again. When perfume re-entered medieval Europe, it didn't return with luxury or romance. It came with anxiety. The continent was gripped by plague, illness, and the mysterious belief that disease came not from germs, but from bad air. The infamous miasma. People believed that foul odors carried sickness, that invisible vapours drifting through the streets were death itself, and so scent became armour. Doctors wore long bird-like masks stuffed with cloves, cinnamon and lavender. These plague masks weren't just ominous. They were meant to purify the air the physician breathed. Nobles carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with spices and resins, which they sniffed as they walked through crowded markets or narrow alleyways. Even churches began to burn stronger incense, not just for holiness, but for health. Ironically, while fear drove the popularity of perfume, water was increasingly shunned. Bathing, once a ritual in Rome, was now considered dangerous, thought to open the pores to disease. Without washing, scent became the only option to mask body odour. Heavy oils and musks were layered onto the skin. Clothes were fumigated with herbs. Gloves were soaked in orange blossom and cinnamon. It was a strange balance, a society that feared indulgence but desperately needed distraction from the stench of death. Still, amidst the fear, knowledge returned. Through contact with the Islamic world, from crusaders, traders, and scholars, Europe slowly rediscovered the forgotten science of distillation. Alchemists in Spain and Italy began experimenting with roses, lavender, and rosemary. Monasteries, long the keepers of herbal lore, began recording recipes. One of the earliest known alcohol-based perfumes came from Hungary in the 14th century. Hungary water, a blend of rosemary and wine spirits, supposedly used by Queen Elizabeth of Hungary to restore her youth and beauty. Perfume had begun to evolve again, this time away from oils and toward lighter, more refreshing spirits. But the real revolution was still to come. In a small town in southern France, a new centre of perfume was quietly being born, one that would take scent from superstition to sophistication and turn fragrance into fashion. Europe was ready to breathe deeply once more. By the 16th century, the heart of perfume had shifted once more, this time to France. And at its centre stood a city that smelled not of sewage or disease, but of jasmine, roses, and blooming orange trees. That city was Grasse. Tucked into the hills of Provence, Grasse was originally known for tanning leather, a pungent trade. But when Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, arrived from Italy, she brought with her a love of fragrance. She employed her own personal perfumer, who began scenting gloves to mask the smell of tanned hides. The trend caught on. Soon, Grasse transitioned from leather to lavender. The sun-drenched fields around the city became the cradle of modern perfumery. Rose petals were harvested at dawn. Jasmine was hand-picked at night, when its scent was strongest. Orange blossoms and violets were distilled into delicate oils. What began as a practical solution became a national obsession. As the French court grew more extravagant, so did its appetite for fragrance. Versailles, the grand palace of Louis XIV, became a temple of scent. Rooms were perfumed with orange water. Furniture was rubbed with scented wax. Courtiers powdered their wigs with violet and amber. Even the fountains were rumoured to spray rosewater during royal celebrations. But behind the glamour was necessity. Bathing was still uncommon, and perfumes masked the realities of poor hygiene. Royals and nobles sometimes changed their clothes multiple times a day, not to be clean, but to appear fresh-scented. Perfumers became artisans in their own right. They trained for years, guarding their recipes like state secrets. The art of perfume composition, balancing top notes, heart notes, and base notes, was refined to perfection. Then came the 18th century, the Enlightenment. Science and chemistry advanced, and with it, so did perfumery. Alcohol-based scents became more stable. Glass bottles grew more elegant. Perfume shops opened across Paris, offering custom scents to the fashionable elite. Perfume was no longer a mask against disease or a whisper to the divine. It was now luxury, identity, a silent language spoken through memory and skin. And as France led the world in fragrance, perfume was poised to step into modernity, poised to become personal, powerful, and profoundly human. As the 19th century unfolded, The world was changing, fast. Industrial revolutions transformed cities. New classes emerged. Art, fashion, and technology collided. And in the midst of it all, perfume entered a new phase, no longer just for priests, kings, or courtiers, but for everyone. For the first time, perfume became deeply personal. Scientific breakthroughs made it possible to isolate aroma molecules and replicate natural scents. Chemists discovered synthetic compounds like coumarin, the sweet smell of hay, and vanillin, the warm note of vanilla. Suddenly, perfume no longer depended solely on nature's whims. It could now be invented. This revolution didn't destroy artistry, it expanded it. Perfumers were now composers, building scent like music, layering top notes that danced lightly, heart notes that lingered, and bass notes that stayed close to the skin long after the first impression faded. In 1889, a milestone arrived, Jicky by Guerlain. It was one of the first perfumes to blend natural essences with synthetic notes. And it didn't smell like flowers or fruit. It smelled like mystery. It marked the birth of modern perfumery. Soon, scent became a signature, a way of expressing identity. By the early 20th century, perfume was being marketed not as ritual or royalty, but as emotion. Bottles were designed like sculpture. Ads promised fantasy, romance, and freedom. To wear a scent was to choose who you wanted to be. Then, in 1921, another revolution, Chanel No. 5. Created by perfumer Ernest Beau and fashion icon Coco Chanel, it broke the rules. It didn't smell like roses or violets. It smelled clean, modern, abstract. Chanel said she wanted a scent like a woman, not a flower. And the world listened. No. 5 became a symbol of elegance, worn by women who were claiming their independence. Perfume had travelled far from temple smoke and sacred oils. Now it was wrapped in cellophane, sold in department stores, worn to dinners, dances, and dreams. It had become invisible fashion, a mood, a memory in a bottle. And with each passing decade, fragrance would grow bolder, more rebellious, a silent rebellion worn on the skin. The 20th century brought both glamour and devastation, and perfume, ever tied to the mood of the world, evolved with each turn of history. During the World Wars, raw materials for fragrance became scarce. Jasmine fields were abandoned. Trade routes collapsed. Perfumers, like everyone else, adapted. Some turned to synthetic substitutes. Others rationed ingredients, creating lighter, simpler colognes. The bold, indulgent perfumes of the pre-war years gave way to practicality and restraint. Fragrance, like fashion, responded to necessity. And yet, even in wartime, scent remained personal. Soldiers carried letters scented with perfume from home. A familiar fragrance could offer comfort, intimacy, even courage. For many, the memory of someone's scent, locked in a handkerchief or on the collar of a coat, became a quiet reminder of what was waiting beyond the battlefield. After the wars, the world craved colour, life, and reinvention. The 1950s and 60s saw perfume re-enter pop culture, no longer just an elite indulgence. It was mass-produced, advertised in magazines, and linked to celebrities and silver screen icons. Marilyn Monroe famously claimed she wore nothing to bed but Chanel No. 5, a line that transformed a perfume into legend. The fragrance industry exploded. New scents like Diarissimo, Arpège, and Youth Dew offered women different personas: elegant, innocent, seductive, rebellious. Perfume counters offered not just smells, but stories. You could choose who you wanted to be, or become someone entirely new, with just a spray. Men's fragrances also took off, offering colognes that balanced rugged masculinity with refinement. The 1980s brought power scents, bold, unapologetic perfumes that matched the era's shoulder pads and Wall Street ambition. But as the century neared its end, something shifted again. The public grew more aware of ingredients, of sustainability, allergies, transparency. People began to ask, what is in this bottle? The demand for natural, ethical, and artisan-made perfumes began to rise. Niche perfumers emerged, crafting small batch scents with storytelling at their core. Perfume was no longer just big business. It was memory. It was rebellion. It was authenticity. And once again, fragrance had become a mirror, reflecting a world both uncertain and yearning to be remembered. In the final chapter, we'll explore where perfume is headed, and why, even in a digital world, we still long to leave behind a trace of scent. Today, we live in a world where nearly everything is digital, immediate, and endlessly replicable. We scroll, swipe, and stream. But amid all this speed and sound, scent remains different, timeless, analog, and deeply human. You can't download a perfume. You can't post its aroma. You have to wear it, feel it, let it linger. And perhaps that's why, despite centuries of change, perfume still matters. In recent years, the fragrance world has entered a new era, one of introspection, creativity, and reinvention. Niche perfumeries have flourished, offering rare, often unconventional scents that tell stories rather than follow trends. Instead of just flowers and musk, we now find perfumes that smell like parchment, forest rain, antique leather, or even nostalgia itself. Consumers no longer want to smell like everyone else. They want scent to feel personal, intimate, and real. A return to craftsmanship has emerged, where perfumers are treated like poets or painters. Small studios source responsibly, experiment bravely, and write their formulas like love letters. At the same time, science continues to push the boundaries. We can now map the molecular structure of a scent, recreate extinct flowers, capture the smell of space. Some perfumers are even collaborating with AI to generate new combinations never imagined before. There's also a growing movement towards sustainability. Many major brands are shifting toward biodegradable ingredients, reusable bottles, and ethical sourcing. The new luxury isn't just about the label, it's about the story behind the scent. And for all the technology we have, the reason we reach for perfume remains the same: memory. A scent can bring someone back. A single breath of lavender or tobacco or orange peel can transport you to a kitchen, a train station, a lost summer evening. Perfume is our invisible diary, a way to be remembered or to remember. From ancient Egyptian altars to French fashion houses, from battlefield love letters to digital AI labs, perfume has always traced the edges of who we are. It is history you wear, emotion in vapor, presence in absence. And as long as we long to be noticed, cherished, or simply felt, the story of perfume will never really end. It will simply float, just beyond the senses, waiting for someone to breathe it in. As the 1500s drew to a close, Italy was brimming with the energy of transformation. The Renaissance had rekindled a passion for the ancient world, not just its statues and philosophies, but its myths, its theatre, and its music. Painters captured divine moments in human form. Architects resurrected the balance of Roman geometry. But musicians, they searched for something deeper. They asked a peculiar question: what did ancient Greek drama sound like? This question wasn't academic. It was spiritual. The thinkers of the late Renaissance believed that the plays of Sophocles and Euripides were not spoken, but sung. That in ancient times, music and speech had flowed together, as one. And that perhaps, in rediscovering this fusion, something new could be born. In Florence, a small circle of poets, composers, and scholars gathered around Count Giovanni de Bardi. They called themselves the Camerata, and their mission was bold. They wanted to recreate the emotional power of Greek tragedy, not with spectacle, but with sound. A music that could move the soul directly, without the tangled counterpoints of the era's choral style. One of their most passionate members was Vincenzo Galilei, father of the astronomer Galileo. He argued that harmony should not dominate expression. that music should mirror speech, rise and fall with the rhythm of thought and feeling. It was a revolutionary idea. That melody, not complexity, held the key to human emotion. Out of this belief, a new musical form emerged. Monody, a single melodic line, sung by one voice, supported by a simple instrumental accompaniment. It wasn't opera yet, but it was something entirely new. A voice, unencumbered, telling a story not with words alone, but with feeling. The first experiments were modest: court performances, private gatherings, musical dramas based on myth, designed not to dazzle, but to stir. And slowly, something remarkable began to take shape. This was not church music, not madrigals for noble banquets. This was theatre, sung, living, human. A new art form was beginning to breathe, not just sound and not just story, but both, fused into something ancient, and yet entirely new. Opera was still unnamed, but it had taken its first breath. The Florentine Camerata, that quiet circle of scholars, poets, and musicians, never set out to create an entirely new genre. They saw themselves as archaeologists of sound, attempting to revive a lost tradition. But in their search for ancient truth, they unknowingly gave birth to something timeless. Their experiments with monody, expressive solo singing over a simple accompaniment, quickly evolved. They began blending recitation and melody, creating compositions that moved between speech and song, allowing characters to reveal emotions not just with words, but through rising and falling tones that mimicked natural speech patterns. The result was recitative, the heartbeat of early opera. In 1597, composer Jacopo Peri premiered Daphne, often considered the first opera. Based on a Greek myth, it was a small, intimate performance staged for the Florentine elite. Only fragments survive today, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, music carried the entire drama, not just enhancing the story, but telling it. Peri followed this with Eurydice in 1600, composed for the wedding of Maria de' Medici to King Henry IV of France. It was the first complete opera that still survives, and though primitive by today's standards, it featured many of the essential components: sung dialogue, arias, choruses, and instrumental interludes. It was both ceremony and innovation, the sound of a tradition being born in real time. Another key figure emerged: Giulio Caccini. He published a collection called Les Nouvelles Musiques, featuring solo songs written in the monodic style. His compositions were more lyrical, more ornamented, pushing monody closer to what would become the operatic aria, a moment for the voice to linger, soar, and express the inexpressible. These early operas weren't grand. They had no massive orchestras, no elaborate staging. They were chamber dramas, intimate performances designed to stir the emotions of elite audiences. But even in their modest form, they revealed the potential of opera as an emotional engine. Music could now weep, plead, celebrate, and grieve, all through the human voice. The Camerata may have longed to revive the ancient world. Instead, they created something entirely modern, a new fusion of art, music, poetry, and performance. Opera had stepped into the light. While Jacopo Peri and Giulio Caccini laid the foundations of opera, it was Claudio Monteverdi who turned it into art. Born in Cremona in 1567, Monteverdi was a bridge between two worlds, the Renaissance and the Baroque. Trained in the complexities of madrigals, he understood harmony, counterpoint, and the expressive power of the human voice. But more than that, he had a gift for emotion. Where Peri had built a structure, Monteverdi breathed life into it. In 1607, he premiered L'Orfeo in Mantua, a retelling of the myth of Orpheus, the musician who journeys to the underworld in search of his beloved Eurydice. The story had already been set to music by others, but Monteverdi's version was different. It wasn't just a sequence of scenes, it was a unified dramatic experience. L'Orfeo featured a full orchestra, rare for the time, with strings, harpsichords, flutes, cornets, and even trombones. It opened with a lively toccata, followed by a prologue sung by Music herself, who promised to guide the audience through joy and sorrow. Then came the story, a rich blend of recitative, arias, and choral passages, all stitched together by instrumental interludes. What made L'Orfeo revolutionary wasn't just its scale, it was its soul. Monteverdi didn't treat music as background, he made it speak. When Orpheus rejoices, the music dances. When he mourns, it weeps. When he defies the gods, the harmonies twist and turn in defiance. The emotions weren't hinted at, they were embodied, made audible through melody and harmony. The opera was a triumph. Performed for the court of Mantua, L'Orfeo was praised for its innovation and beauty. It proved that opera wasn't just an intellectual experiment. It was entertainment, passion, and power. Monteverdi would go on to compose other operas, including L'Arianna and Il Ritorno d'Ulisse in Patria. Many are lost, but his influence endured. He showed that opera could carry both grandeur and intimacy, that myth, music, and humanity could live on the same stage. With Monteverdi, opera ceased to be a theory. It became theatre. Opera began as a courtly affair, a private performance for nobles, scholars, and the elite. But in the 1630s, something remarkable happened. Opera stepped out of the palace and into the city. That city was Venice. In 1637, the first public opera house opened its doors, the Teatro San Cassiano. For the first time in history, ordinary citizens, not just dukes and duchesses, could buy a ticket and watch a staged musical drama. It was a radical shift. Opera had been born in scholarly salons and ducal courts. Now it was entertainment for the masses. Venice was the perfect place for this transformation. A city built on trade, mystery, and spectacle, it thrived on drama, both in the streets and on the stage. The Venetian carnival already blurred the lines between classes, masks hiding identity and status. Opera added another layer of enchantment. Soon, more theatres followed. By the mid-1600s, Venice had over a dozen opera houses, each competing for attention. The opera season aligned with carnival, a time of revelry, indulgence, and performance. It became a tradition. Citizens, visitors, and aristocrats alike packed the theatres to hear the latest works. This new audience brought changes to the art itself. Composers adapted their styles. Music became more expressive, with arias growing longer and more virtuosic. Plots leaned toward romance, betrayal, and spectacle. Scenery became lavish, ships, palaces, infernos rising from trapdoors, all designed to dazzle. Theatres were also restructured. Boxes were added for noble families. The pit filled with the general public. Opera was no longer just heard, it was watched, and star performers began to emerge. Most notably, the castrati. These were male singers who had been castrated as boys to preserve their high vocal range. As tragic as the practice was, it created voices unlike any other. Powerful, agile, soaring. Castrati became celebrities, adored and envied, their names whispered across Europe. In Venice, opera had become a business, a blend of high art and mass appeal. It was no longer a revival of ancient Greece. It was something fully alive, unpredictable, and deeply human. Opera had found its stage, and the world would never be the same. As opera flourished in Venice and beyond, one element began to rise above all others: the voice. Opera was no longer just about drama or philosophy. It became a showcase for extraordinary singers, and the most celebrated among them were the castrati, men with the vocal range of sopranos or altos, but the lung power and control of adult male bodies. Their voices were surreal, agile, brilliant, otherworldly. They could float delicately over an orchestra or hurl thunder down from the stage. While the practice of castration was morally and medically troubling, the castrati were the superstars of the 17th and 18th centuries. They commanded enormous fees, inspired frenzied admiration, and were often adored far beyond their voice alone. Some lived lavish lives, collecting art, lovers, and legends. Composers began writing with these singers in mind. Operas grew more elaborate in structure to highlight their talents. The da capo aria, an ABA song form, became a favorite. It allowed the singer to deliver a simple melody, then depart into elaborate improvisation when the first section returned. This became the moment audiences waited for, when the performer, alone in the spotlight, would soar. The theatre had transformed. No longer a place for communal storytelling, it was a temple of the voice. People came to hear what seemed humanly impossible: trills, runs, and leaps carried on a single breath. But it wasn't only the castrati who dazzled. Sopranos and tenors also rose to prominence, each claiming emotional territory. The grieving queen, the desperate lover, the betrayed hero. Characters became vessels for vocal brilliance. A singer could hold the stage for 10 minutes or more, commanding silence, gasps, and thunderous applause. The power of opera now lay in its ability to elevate the human voice into something divine. It was raw emotion, not spoken but sung, stretched to its furthest, most impossible edge. In the age of virtuosity, the voice was king. Audiences didn't just follow the story, they followed the singer, and composers would soon begin shaping opera not around mythology or philosophy, but around the magnificent voices they had to serve. While Venice had given opera its public stage, other Italian cities soon made their own contributions, each leaving a distinct mark on the art form. Chief among them were Rome and Naples. In Rome, opera took a different shape. The Papal States, governed by the Church, placed stricter limits on public performances. Yet this didn't stop creativity. It merely redirected it. Opera became more sacred, more symbolic, and more theatrical in form. Since women were often banned from the stage, male performers, including castrati, took on female roles, adding a strange, almost surreal layer to the performances. Roman opera emphasized grandeur and moral gravity. The staging was elaborate, the language elevated, and the characters often drawn from biblical or allegorical themes. Composers experimented with combining dramatic action with spectacle, flooding the stage, dropping gods from the ceiling, or unveiling massive sets that moved before the audience's eyes. Opera here was a kind of sacred illusion, a mixture of devotion and entertainment, designed to impress both spiritually and artistically. Then there was Naples, where opera found both technical brilliance and emotional fire. Naples became a musical powerhouse in the late 1600s. With its renowned conservatories and patronage from the Spanish Bourbon court, it cultivated some of the finest composers, singers, and teachers in Europe. Here, opera seria, the serious opera, truly took shape. Opera seria focused on noble characters, drawn from ancient myths or heroic tales. It followed strict rules, 3 acts, alternating recitative and aria, with clear moral themes of justice, sacrifice, and virtue. But within these rules, Naples encouraged emotional expression and vocal ornamentation. It was a city of feeling, and its operas often emphasized deep personal suffering or exaltation. Composers like Alessandro Scarlatti helped codify this style, setting the stage for generations to come. He wrote dozens of operas, many featuring long, expressive arias that pushed singers to the limits of breath and technique. Naples turned opera into a training ground for stars, and its influence would soon spread throughout Europe. From the ceremonial halls of Rome to the vibrant theatres of Naples, opera was expanding. It was no longer a Florentine experiment. It was an Italian phenomenon, and soon it would go even farther. By the early 18th century, Italy had become the undisputed heart of opera, but opera itself was no longer confined to Italian soil. It began to travel, northward, outward, carried by singers, composers, and noble fascination. And across Europe, it was received not just as a novelty, but as a sensation. In France, opera was adapted to fit a very different cultural taste. Under Louis XIV, tragédie lyrique was born, a genre blending dance, chorus, and elaborate stagecraft with the grandeur of French classical drama. While Italian opera focused on vocal brilliance, the French leaned towards spectacle and unity of form. Composers like Jean-Baptiste Lully and later Rameau borrowed from Italian techniques but rooted their work in national identity. Still, many French patrons and aristocrats couldn't resist the allure of Italian virtuosity. In Germany, the seeds of a distinct operatic tradition began to grow, yet Italian influence remained strong. German courts hired Italian composers and castrati. Even a young George Frideric Handel, before settling in London, trained in Italy, absorbing its vocal and dramatic style before blending it with German and English traditions. His early operas, written in Italian, were staged across the continent. But it was in England that Italian opera found one of its most enthusiastic, if occasionally bewildered, audiences. In the early 1700s, London's theatres began producing full-length Italian operas, often with imported stars. The aristocracy flocked to hear the castrati, marvelling at their otherworldly voices. The most famous of these was Farinelli, a singer whose fame reached near-mythic proportions. He sang for kings, cured depression with his voice, and inspired composers to write arias of impossible beauty. Opera had become Europe's elite art form, an international language of music, emotion, and power. Italian was the preferred language of opera, even in non-Italian cities. To attend the opera was to be fashionable, cultured, and connected to a larger world of beauty. And yet, as opera spread, something began to shift. National traditions were forming. Local languages began to appear on stage, and a new generation of composers, some Italian, some not, would soon reshape the genre again. Opera had conquered Europe, but its next transformation would take it from courtly elegance to something far more human. For decades, opera had belonged to gods and kings. It told stories of ancient heroes and mythic sacrifices, sung in high style with noble restraint. But by the mid-18th century, something began to stir at the edge of the gilded stage. Laughter. And with it came a new kind of opera buffa, literally meaning comic opera. Opera buffa was born in Naples and quickly spread through Italy and beyond. It rejected the stiff formality of opera seria in favour of something more human, lively plots, ordinary characters, and sharp satire. These operas featured cunning servants, foolish old men, jealous lovers, and mistaken identities. They poked fun at vanity, greed, and the upper class. They gave the spotlight not to gods, but to people you might pass on the street. The music followed suit. Gone were the endless da capo arias and lofty recitatives. Instead, ensembles burst onto the stage, characters singing over each other, interrupting, reacting in real time. Rhythms quickened, comic timing sharpened, and the orchestration grew more playful. Laughter became part of the musical language. One of the earliest landmarks was Giovanni Battista Pergolese's La Serva Padrona, 1733, a short intermezzo that became wildly popular across Europe. It featured just 3 characters, a clever maid, her bumbling master, and a mute servant. And it managed to turn a simple domestic situation into a charming commentary on gender, class, and control. The success of works like La Serva Padrona showed that audiences were hungry for something more relatable, stories where emotion and humour were grounded in the everyday. Opera buffa didn't just entertain, it reshaped the operatic world. It influenced composers across Europe, even those writing in more serious styles. Eventually, Mozart would take these ideas and elevate them in masterpieces like The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, blending comic wit with profound human insight. But it all began in Italy, with streetwise maids, scheming barbers, and lovesick poets. Opera had found a new voice, not just divine, but earthly, not just majestic, but mischievous. And in doing so, it opened the doors even wider, letting laughter, flaws, and real life onto the grand stage. By the end of the 18th century, opera had become one of the most powerful art forms in Europe, and at the heart of it all was Italy. From Florence to Venice, from Naples to Rome, Italy had not only birthed opera, it had shaped it, matured it, and scattered its influence across every major cultural capital. Opera had grown from the quiet philosophical experiments of the Camerata into a roaring tapestry of voice, music, emotion, and spectacle, and while it would continue to evolve, shift, and break its own rules, its foundation would always rest on Italian soil. As the 19th century approached, opera was poised for yet another transformation, a deeper plunge into emotional realism, nationalism, and the psychological interior of its characters. Giants like Rossini, Donizetti, and later Verdi and Puccini would lead opera into new realms, where music and drama became inseparable forces driving toward catharsis. But that was a future built upon what came before. The birth of opera was not a single moment, but a chain of revelations. It was the belief that music could heighten language, that voice could carry character, that myth, comedy, love, and grief could be sung into life. And most of all, that an art form could invite its audience to feel, deeply, vividly, and sometimes unbearably. Italy had given the world a stage where gods could fall in love, peasants could outwit princes, and silence could be filled with soaring sound. Even today, the fingerprints of early Italian opera remain. Modern theatre, musical film, orchestral composition, all are touched by this legacy. The arias of Monteverdi, the farce of opera buffa, the architecture of Venetian theatres, they still echo in our ears, if we know how to listen. Opera, in its essence, is a human invention trying to express what words alone cannot contain. And Italy, centuries ago, was the place where it first found its voice. From the whisper of a myth in Florence, to the applause in Venice, to the laughter in Naples, opera was born not from perfection, but from passion. A stage was set, a curtain rose, and a world began to sing. In the centuries before 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean thrived in a way the world had never seen before. This was the height of the Late Bronze Age, a time when powerful empires rose along the coasts, mountains, and river valleys of the ancient world, and they were not alone. They were connected. To the west, the Mycenaeans ruled from fortified palaces across mainland Greece. In the north, the Hittite Empire controlled vast stretches of Anatolia from their capital, Hattusa. Along the eastern shore, the bustling cities of Canaan traded goods and ideas with all who came by sea. To the south, the mighty Egyptian New Kingdom reigned, a civilization of monumental temples and grand pharaohs. And far to the east, the Babylonians and Assyrians watched with cautious eyes. These weren't isolated cultures. They spoke different languages and worshipped different gods, but they relied on one another. Ships crossed the seas carrying copper from Cyprus and tin from Afghanistan, the two metals needed to make bronze, the very substance that defined the age. Luxury goods flowed through trade routes: ivory, lapis lazuli, gold, linen, perfumes, and chariots. Grain fed the cities. Letters passed between kings, not hostile threats, but diplomatic greetings, sometimes affectionate. These were written in Akkadian, the international language of royal correspondence. They called each other brother. It was, in many ways, the first globalized age, an international system of shared resources, trade, and delicate diplomacy. Power was maintained not just through force, but through balance. But such complexity comes with risk. When one node weakens, others feel the strain. When trade falters, cities suffer. When alliances fail, enemies find openings. And when disaster strikes, whether from nature, famine, war, or internal collapse, the system begins to crack. Around 1200 BCE, the cracks became fractures, and then collapse. Within a span of just a few decades, nearly every major palace in the eastern Mediterranean was destroyed or abandoned. Writing systems vanished. Populations declined. Trade routes were severed. Literacy faded. The very world that had seemed eternal, with its kings, its scribes, its gods, its gold, crumbled into silence. The Bronze Age ended not with a final battle, but with a mystery that still echoes today. Across the hills and plains of mainland Greece, stone palaces once rose like fortresses. The Mycenaeans, heirs to Minoan influence and masters of maritime trade, had built a network of powerful city-states: Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes. Each was ruled by a onax, a warrior king, and supported by a class of scribes, artisans, and soldiers. Their culture was literate, centralized, and fiercely militarized. They left behind records in a script called Linear B, listing everything from food rations to chariot wheels. They were deeply organized, capable of raising armies, building massive fortifications, and managing complex trade across the Aegean and beyond. But sometime around 1200 BCE, the Mycenaean world began to unravel. First came destruction. One by one, the palaces fell. Pylos was burned to the ground. Mycenae was damaged, perhaps twice. Tiryns and Thebes suffered the same fate. Linear B vanished. No more tablets, no more records. The bureaucracies collapsed. What followed was silence. Towns shrank. Monumental architecture ceased. Trade links broke down. A dark age began, not in the poetic sense, but literal. For centuries, there would be no writing in Greece, no palaces, no grand cities, only scattered villages clinging to memory and myth. So what happened? There are theories, many, and none complete. Some suggest earthquakes. The region lies along fault lines, and multiple cities show signs of seismic damage. Others point to invasion or rebellion, perhaps internal unrest from a lower class long suppressed by palace elites. Still others speak of famine, triggered by climate shifts or drought, that weakened populations and sowed chaos. And then there's the spectre of the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who appear again and again in Egyptian records, a possible external force that may have reached Greek shores as well. The truth may lie in a combination of all these. The Mycenaean world was complex, and complexity breeds vulnerability. When systems are tightly interwoven, collapse can cascade. And so, a civilization that inspired Homer's tales of Agamemnon, of Achilles, of Troy, vanished not with a single defeat, but with a slow and systemic disintegration. Its echoes, however, would shape the very foundation of Greek identity for centuries to come. To the north of the crumbling Mycenaean world lay the Hittite Empire, once one of the great superpowers of the late Bronze Age. Centered in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the Hittites had built an empire through war, diplomacy, and innovation. They rivaled Egypt, challenged Assyria, and signed the world's first known international peace treaty after the Battle of Kadesh. Their capital, Hattusa, was a marvel of engineering, ringed with walls, filled with temples, libraries, and royal archives. From here, kings issued commands to distant governors, settled disputes through cuneiform tablets, and corresponded with pharaohs as equals. Then, around 1190 BCE, the messages stopped. The city was destroyed, abandoned, its buildings collapsed, its archives buried beneath ash and stone. No grand inscription records the cause. No surviving tablet warns of what came. The empire simply ceased. In its place rose silence and confusion. So what happened to the Hittites? Some evidence suggests that the heartland suffered waves of invasions or migrations, perhaps by displaced peoples from the west. Their vassal states in Syria and Cilicia were attacked. Others propose internal instability, with rival factions weakening the core. Food shortages may have followed, possibly due to prolonged drought, and led to economic collapse. Once the capital fell, the empire's loosely bound territories disintegrated quickly. Unlike Egypt, which survived the storm, the Hittites were not spared. Their central control crumbled, their administration vanished, and their people faded into a collection of fragmented kingdoms, later called the Neo-Hittites, scattered across northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. But the grandeur was gone. A kingdom that had held its own against pharaohs and kings, that had harnessed the secrets of iron and law, that had balanced war with diplomacy, disappeared from the historical stage for over 3,000 years until rediscovered by archaeologists in the 20th century. Today, we piece together their story from clay tablets and ruined gates. The Hittites left no lament, but the scale of their fall, the sudden silence of Hattusa, still stirs wonder and warning. In a world so carefully built, even the strongest walls could not withstand what was coming. Of all the great powers of the late Bronze Age, Egypt stood longest and fell hardest into memory. In the 13th century BCE, under pharaohs like Ramesses II, Egypt was strong, sophisticated, and stable. It had held the line against the Hittites, erected colossal temples along the Nile, and kept the desert tribes at bay. Its influence stretched deep into Canaan and Syria, with vassal cities sending tribute to the pharaoh in gold, grain, and loyalty. But by the reign of Ramesses III, just a few decades later, Egypt was on the defensive. Something was coming. Egypt's records speak of invasions from a mysterious force known only as the Sea Peoples, confederations of warriors arriving by land and sea, wielding weapons and fire. They swept through the eastern Mediterranean, attacking cities, destroying palaces, and collapsing kingdoms. In his inscriptions at Medinet Habu, Ramesses III describes a coalition of invaders descending upon Egypt like a storm. He names them the Peliset, Sherdan, Luka, Shekelesh. They came with chariots and ships, burning cities as they advanced. They had already destroyed Hatti. They had crushed cities in the Levant, and now they were at Egypt's borders. Ramesses prepared for battle. He fortified the delta, raised a navy, and met them on land and sea. Egypt won, barely. The invaders were repelled. Their remnants were settled in border regions, some absorbed into Egyptian society. But the cost of victory was steep. Egypt survived, but changed. After Ramesses III, the empire weakened rapidly. Central authority eroded. Tombs were robbed. Grain was scarce. A labor strike, the first recorded in history, took place in Deir el-Medina. The age of empire was over. Egypt withdrew into itself, no longer the towering power of the past, but a kingdom bracing for the long decline ahead. Unlike Mycenae or Hattusa, Egypt left us records, desperate, vivid, etched in stone. It remembered the Sea Peoples. It chronicled its own struggle, and though it did not fall completely, Egypt too was wounded by the collapse. A civilization that had endured for 2,000 years had met its limit. Even the Nile could not stop the storm. Among the most enduring mysteries of the Bronze Age collapse are the Sea Peoples, a vague but ominous presence that appears again and again in the records of Egypt, Ugarit, and other coastal civilizations. They were never a single tribe or nation, but a confederation, moving by both land and sea, leaving ruin in their wake. But who were they? The Egyptians list names: Peliset, Sherdan, Shekelesh, Denian, Jeker, groups whose exact identities remain debated to this day. Some scholars link them to regions in Anatolia, the Aegean, or the Balkans. Others believe they were displaced peoples, migrants fleeing famine, drought, or war, forced to move southward in search of food and land. In the decades around 1200 BCE, cities burned along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The once powerful city of Ugarit, in modern-day Syria, was destroyed. Its last letters, clay tablets buried in its ruins, tell of urgent requests for help as the enemy closed in. The aid never arrived. These attackers used both chariots and ships, suggesting they were organized and well-equipped. Some scholars believe they were once mercenaries, employed by the great powers, but later turning against them. Others suggest they were part of a mass migration, entire communities on the move, warriors, families, animals and all, driven by desperation. Egypt uniquely fought back and survived, but the Sea Peoples had already left devastation in their wake. In some places, they settled. The Peliset, mentioned in Ramesses III's inscriptions, are widely believed to be the Philistines, later known from biblical texts as fierce enemies of the Israelites in Canaan. So were the Sea People's invaders, or victims? Perhaps both. Their arrival may have been a symptom, not a cause, part of a chain reaction triggered by climate change, famine, and systemic collapse. When central powers failed to feed their people, populations moved, and when the food ran out, people fought. The Sea Peoples remain nameless in many ways, but their legacy is clear. They were the face of chaos. They were the signal that the old world was dying. And as they landed on distant shores, they left behind more than fire and ash. They left behind a broken age. While war and invasion left visible scars, another force crept quietly beneath the surface: climate. In recent decades, scientists and archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a prolonged period of drought in the eastern Mediterranean, beginning around 1200 BCE. Pollen samples, sediment cores, and abandoned fields suggest that rainfall sharply declined, and with it, harvests failed. For civilizations built on agriculture, this was catastrophic. The great empires of the Bronze Age depended on grain surpluses to feed their people, pay workers, and trade with neighbors. When crops failed, cities starved. When granaries emptied, economies collapsed. The interdependence that once made the region thrive now became a weakness. Letters from Ugarit, discovered in the ruins of the city, speak of grain shipments being delayed or withheld. Hittite texts describe urgent appeals for food. Even in Egypt, where the Nile's floods had long been a dependable source of stability, signs of stress emerge. Rameses III had to allocate grain for refugees and workers, straining the empire's resources. In times of abundance, these systems worked, but in scarcity, they faltered. Famine didn't just cause hunger, it caused panic. Trade routes broke down as regions hoarded resources. People abandoned cities for the countryside. Some turned to raiding, others to migration. In this vacuum, order began to erode. The cities of the Bronze Age weren't built to withstand long-term instability. They were complex machines, reliant on bureaucracies, scribes, armies, and trade. They were centralized. When a palace burned, so too did the infrastructure around it. And with no written laws or constitutions, legitimacy came from tradition and power. When that power failed to deliver food or security, it lost its authority. Climate, then, may not have been the sole cause, but it was a catalyst, weakening the foundations just enough for other pressures to bring the structure down. In the collapse of the Bronze Age, it wasn't one enemy at the gates, it was many. And one of the most relentless came from the sky. When the rains stopped, the world began to fall apart. In the grand palaces of the Bronze Age world, writing was power. It was how kings issued commands, how grain was counted, how treaties were signed. From the cuneiform tablets of the Hittites to the Linear B records of Mycenaean Greece, writing held empires together. It was not for the masses, it was for the elite, the administrators, the scribes. But as the palaces fell, so did their archives. Around 1200 BCE, entire writing systems vanished. In Greece, Linear B was lost. The knowledge of how to read it disappeared for centuries. Ugaritic, the alphabetic cuneiform script of a great Syrian port city, was no longer used after its destruction. Even in Anatolia, the bureaucratic tablets of the Hittites came to a sudden halt. The silence wasn't just political, it was literal. This wasn't just the loss of language, it was the collapse of memory. Without writing, history cannot be recorded, taxes cannot be collected, and laws cannot be preserved. What was once a highly structured, literate society now became oral, informal, and fragmented. For generations, the stories of gods and kings had to survive not on clay or parchment, but in song and speech, passed down across smoky hearths and village gatherings. This may be why so much of what we know from the centuries that followed comes in the form of myth. From the ruins of Mycenaean Greece would eventually rise the stories of Achilles, Odysseus, and Agamemnon. Not written by historians, but sung by poets. The Iliad and the Odyssey, composed centuries later, may carry the fading echoes of a world whose records were reduced to rubble. And so, the Dark Age began, not because knowledge was intentionally destroyed, but because the scribes who kept it disappeared. Without palaces, there were no archives. Without surplus, no need for inventories. Without kings, no one to command the script. This was not just a political collapse, it was a cultural one. A civilization that could once write across thousands of miles had forgotten its letters. It would take centuries for writing to return to Greece. Centuries before scripts were reborn. And by then, the Bronze Age was long gone, buried beneath layers of ash, myth, and time. Among the most haunting aspects of the Bronze Age collapse was the disappearance of writing. Civilizations that had once recorded every detail, every shipment of grain, every treaty, every prayer to the gods, fell silent. In the centuries leading up to the collapse, writing flourished. The Hittites used cuneiform to communicate across their empire. Ugarit developed its own alphabetic script. The Mycenaeans wrote in Linear B, a script used by palace scribes to track resources, labor, and offerings. The Egyptians, of course, carved their history in stone, but also kept detailed records on papyrus. But when the palaces fell, so did the scribes. Linear B vanished with the Mycenaeans. Not a single tablet was written in Greece for hundreds of years after their fall. Cuneiform, once the common script of international diplomacy, disappeared from use outside of Assyria and Babylon. Ugaritic script, one of the earliest known alphabets, died with the burning of its cities. In Egypt, literacy declined along with central control. This was more than a cultural loss. It was a loss of memory. Writing was how the Bronze Age world remembered itself. It preserved its laws, rituals, lineages, and treaties. Without it, stories were no longer passed through ink and clay, but through oral tradition, vulnerable to forgetting, distortion, and myth-making. In Greece, for example, history slipped into legend. The names of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus survived, not through tablets, but through song. It would take centuries before the alphabet returned and the epic tales of the Iliad and Odyssey were finally written down. The collapse of writing also meant a collapse in coordination. Without record-keeping, taxation faltered, armies went unpaid, and supply systems crumbled. Even religion changed. Temples were abandoned. Sacred rituals once meticulously recorded were now improvised or lost. What replaced writing was silence, and eventually, reinvention. New scripts would emerge in time, new languages, new mythologies, new powers. But the bridge between the late Bronze Age and the classical civilizations to come would be built on memory that had to be reconstructed, piece by piece. The voices of the Bronze Age had once filled libraries and archives. Now they are echoes, fragments pressed into clay, forgotten until rediscovered. When the dust of the Bronze Age collapse settled, the old world was gone. The great empires, Mycenae, Hatti, Ugarit, lay in ruins. Trade routes were broken, palaces were abandoned, writing had gone silent, populations had shrunk. And yet, out of this darkness, something new began to stir. The centuries that followed, roughly between 1100 and 800 BCE, are sometimes called the Greek Dark Age, but this is a misnomer. Yes, there were fewer cities, fewer luxuries, and fewer written records. But beneath the surface, people adapted. They built smaller, more sustainable communities. They turned to iron, a material more abundant and accessible than bronze. It was harder to smelt, but once mastered, it became the foundation of a new technological age. The Iron Age had begun, not with fanfare, but with quiet resilience. In Greece, the survivors of Mycenaean collapse became the ancestors of the classical world. Oral traditions preserved fragments of the past, passed down through generations of bards, until poets like Homer captured them in epic verse. From myth and memory, new identities were forged. In the Levant, new powers rose. The Phoenicians emerged from the ashes of Canaanite cities, reviving trade and spreading a new alphabet, simpler, more flexible than cuneiform, across the Mediterranean. They became the carriers of literacy's rebirth. To the east, Assyria and Babylon rebuilt, eventually rising again as imperial powers, drawing lessons from the chaos that had come before. Even Egypt, though diminished, remained a cultural beacon for centuries, preserving its ancient traditions while navigating a changed world. The collapse was not the end. It was a reset. It stripped away the towering systems of the Bronze Age and cleared space for something different. Smaller kingdoms, new languages, and decentralized powers. The world became more fragmented, more localized, but also more flexible. Innovation emerged from necessity, and the legacy of the Bronze Age, its myths, its ruins, its forgotten languages, lingered like buried seeds, waiting to bloom again. The collapse reminds us that no civilization, however mighty, is immune to change. But from collapse can come renewal. And in the silence that followed the fall, a new story began.